Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. I have a great book for you today. Before I get to that, I just want to ask you this question. Have you ever, in the words of Johnny Paycheck, just said to yourself, or wanted to say to your boss, take this job and shove it? Or have you ever wanted to say, here, have this life, I'm out of here? Or this relationship, take it, shove it, I don't need it. Well, our next guest, Alex Sheshunoff, did this. He said, I'm tired of this life. He told his boss, take this job and shove it, except he was the boss, so he had to say it to himself. And he broke up with his girlfriend, and he went to live on an island in the Pacific. He did the thing we all sometimes dream of at about 10 in the morning. And he's written a book about it, A Beginner's Guide to Paradise. 9 steps to giving up everything so you can move to a Pacific island, wear a loincloth, read 100 books, build a bungalow, diaper a baby monkey, and maybe, just maybe, fall in love. Great title. Longest subtitle I've run across in 3 years. Alex, how are you? Welcome.
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Yeah, that subtitle is embarrassingly long. Sometimes I'm at a party and someone will ask me what the name of my book is, and I had to look it up.
Well, you can just Beginner's Guide to Paradise. That's not a bad title by itself. And I guess in the current publishing world, everybody has a subtitle these days. It's rare to have just a book called Freedom. Usually, especially with nonfiction, usually there's a lengthy subtitle that gives people a quick summation of the book, I suppose.
Yeah. So, that's the short version that you got there, too. That's been edited.
So let's talk about this. You really did this. A lot of people dream of it. They dream of saying, take this job and shove it, and this relationship sucks and I'm out. But very few people do it. They just talk big, but they don't have the courage to actually go through with it. So take me back to that moment when you decided, I'm going to really do this. What brought it on?
Well, I appreciate your asking it. And calling it courage, well, it could go either way. Moving to the South Pacific, could be either extremely ambitious or extremely lazy.
Yes.
But to answer your question, yeah, I grew up in Austin, actually, and then made my way to New York. And while up there, I was running.
Why would you leave Texas to go to New York? What is wrong with you?
That was my first in a series of bad decisions, Phil. But I was running this really small internet company up there, and when this tiny magazine ranked me 96 out of the 100 most influential people working in tech in the city, it was early, so not a huge achievement. But that day I realized I had 2 choices. I could spend the rest of my life working my way up the list, or I could, cancel my subscription. Just exactly what I ended up doing. It seemed like an obvious choice at the time, but it was, I guess, in retrospect, it was a big one too.
Mm-hmm. And you, this was back in like '99 or so, when the dot-com revolution was still revving up.
Yeah, that's right. I managed to ride the whole dot-com boom without making a fortune.
Well, isn't that true? About 99%. I mean, very few actually survived the bubble, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So you might say you were clairvoyant. You got out early.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. I had a friend who called me in 1996 from California, and he said, hey, I had this idea about selling books on the internet.
Oh.
Start a business with me. And you know what I told him, Bill? I said, no, it will never work. Nobody will ever buy a book online.
Well, I have a similar success story back in about '83. I was on some university committee where we were to recommend whether we were going to go with VHS form or beta. Now, you may even be too young to know what I'm talking about, but anyway, they were the major programming formats for videotape, and I recommended against VHS. I said, no, that's crazy. Beta is what you want, and I was very persuasive and forceful, and so I got my way into launch us into the form that quickly died. So we are kindred spirits in seeing the technology of the future. So anyway,
Right.
so you bailed out, and you were also in a relationship at the time.
Yeah, that's right. I was dating a woman, and you know, in retrospect, I had a pretty good life. It wasn't sort of turn your life upside down bad. I had a job, a girlfriend, an apartment, but it wasn't satisfying, and I was worried that in 30 years it would be too late to turn it upside down.
Yes.
And so I had to make a break for it.
Well, at least you didn't have children. You were young. You had a relationship. You weren't married, so no harm, no foul, all fair and war and love and all that. But the thing I found interesting is you were your boss at the time, right? So when you said take this job and shove it, you were saying it to you.
Yeah, that's right. I did realize a problem when when I wanted to quit. I didn't know who really to tell.
So you bailed out of your job and you bailed out of your relationship, and did you? I suppose one thing I couldn't tell from the book, because you never discussed it, it's kind of like sitcoms. They're always traveling, but you don't know how they got the money to do this. So you didn't really talk about your money. How did you sustain yourself when you went off to the Pacific Island? How did you tap your money?
Yeah, well, living in the South Pacific is much cheaper than vacationing there, and there's not much to buy on an island with no stoplights.
That's true.
And in my case, I got lucky. I left during the real estate boom and managed to sublet my apartment and my office for more than I'd been paying. And, in effect, someone was working crazy long hours in New York so I could read a bunch of books in the South Pacific.
Okay.
I find it ironic. My subletter maybe less so.
Did you? How'd you get your money? Did you get were there ATM machines, for God's sakes? I mean, how did you tap your money?
Oh yeah, no, that's a good question. There on the island of Yap, where I ended up first, there was one ATM machine. It often didn't have monies, and so you'd have to time it right. But on Monday mornings, usually
you could go get some money. Now, well, let's talk about that. Yap, what an interesting name. How did you select that? I mean, most people, if you're going to go to paradise, you think Tahiti. So why did you go to Yap?
Well, this is a little embarrassing, also, Bill. But I was at my desk one night, and I Googled really nice Pacific island. That wasn't nearly specific enough. It turns out there are 29,000 islands in the Pacific. But the first one that came up was Yap, and it said that it was still pretty traditional. The women were topless, and people wore loincloths. And what I didn't know at the time was that they had no beaches in Yap, and they had a growing leprosy problem. But I would find that out later.
Yeah. Well, that's in and of itself mystified me. How can you have an island in the Pacific that has no beach? I mean, how's that possible?
Yeah, it seems terrible, right? It's not. All the brochures, they always have beaches.
And no waves, really, right? You said not much wave action.
That's right. There's a surrounding coral reef that's far out, so you can't swim to it, and then that stops the waves, and which enables the mangrove swamps to form.
Well, was it pretty?
I wouldn't describe it that way necessarily. It was dusty. It was a very sleepy place. Only about 2,000 people, and as I said, no street lights. More dogs than people. Probably most of them were asleep in the road.
Yeah.
It wasn't exactly like I imagined, and at the time it was also you could fly there. To get to Yap, you fly 7 hours from Honolulu to Guam, and then 2 hours south. So it's not easy to get to. But I also thought maybe I don't want to live in a place I can just fly away from the moment things get rough. So I ended up going into some other islands as well.
Okay, so you arrive in Yap, and in your book, I remember one of the things you did like is you were met at the airport by topless women who welcomed you.
Yeah, that's right. And I think they also had a form that said something like, "Are you carrying drugs? Yes or no? Remember, honest answers are important." That was so endearing.
So you said, at least in the first 10 minutes, you said, "I love this country."
Exactly. But I ended up thinking, maybe the sort of the South Pacific island of the screensavers and the calendars is still out there somewhere. I had this idea of this sort of perfect capital P paradise, and so I ended up boarding a freighter called the Micro Spirit. It wasn't so much threatened by rust is held together by it. But it goes on the circuit to the sort of outer islands of Yap, and about 600 miles east, I ended up on a little island called Pig, P-I-G.
Why would they name an island Pig, or is it an abbreviation or something?
No, I think it was named after the livestock. They didn't have any pigs on Pig, but the island next door they did. So maybe that was close enough.
Well, now you on this journey, this was funny as hell because you were had a roommate who was somewhat like a sumo wrestler in my mind. You know, a huge guy that you have to share a room with, who was not the most communicative guy in the world.
Yeah, no, that's right. He was from an island called Chuk, or an island group called Chuk, and he was a chief, and his name was Chuck. So it was a tongue. It was Chief Chuck from Chuk.
Chief Chuck.
Like say that, you know.
Yeah, 3 times. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was a man of a few words, but he also served a little bit as my guide to help me sort of navigate those early days. It was tricky because when you arrive on this boat, you can't call in advance to say that you're coming. There's no email, and so I just had to show up and ask if I could stay. I thought about it later, and I realized that somebody had come to my apartment and said, "I had this vision of paradise, and it looks just like your place. Do you mind if I stay for a while?" Like, what would I have said? But they don't get a lot of visitors out there, so they seemed welcoming and appreciative to have somebody come by.
And they wanted you to stay.
Yeah. They, mostly because the Council of Chiefs that gave me permission to go, they advised me to bring cigarettes. So I brought a lot of cigarettes, and they told me to bring Lucky Strikes. And when I showed up to Pig, they said, "Oh my God, we haven't had Lucky Strikes since the end of the war." So they appreciated that too. World War II being.
And then they shared something with you that wasn't quite as desirable for you.
Yeah, that's right. They actually grow their own tobacco out there, and they don't have filters though, so they wrap it in old newspaper, which isn't nearly as lovely as it sounds.
But to be a good guest, you had to smoke this cigarette in the raw, so to speak, no filter. And you said you hadn't smoked since you were in junior high or something.
Yeah, that's right.
That must have been rough.
Well, I mean, I didn't have a lot of self-pity out there. It was a beautiful place, but yeah, smoking the cigarettes was not really my thing. Yeah.
And you would say that there were a lot of flies, and it seemed to surprise you.
Yeah, that's another thing that wasn't really in the brochures. But they have a fly problem. Before I went, I had this idea of doing this experiment. I was going to take away electricity and friends and see which I miss most, that kind of thing. And but it turns out what I ended up missing the most were chairs. On Pig, they don't have chairs. People squat on coconuts. They lie on the ground, but they don't sit in chairs. And
how interesting.
After a while, I found I wanted a chair.
Did you try to make one?
That's funny you mentioned that. I thought about it, and then I thought, oh my gosh, am I really going to be like the only white guy on the island, and I'm going to be like sitting on a chair? Like that would not just like look bad, but maybe be bad.
He's trying to take over. He's building a throne.
You're right. A white horse, the whole deal. So no, I did not build myself a chair.
The other thing I was wondering about, you would talk about them having cars from time to time, and how did they get them? I guess they just brought them on those boats, huh?
Right. On Pig, there were no cars, but there an island that was a little bit further out, maybe another 500 miles, called Sadawal. They don't have any roads, but apparently one night a cargo carrier full of cars from South Korea had like 3,000 cars, and it ran aground on their reef. And and what do you do with 3,000 cars and no roads, right? So they stripped all the batteries out and all the wiring and the lights, and for like 3 months until the batteries ran out, they lit up their island like a Christmas tree.
I'm kind of surprised if you grow up without cars that you know how to do that, but I guess they use batteries all the time, so
yeah,
that would make sense. So is it still there?
No, they ended up having to remove it from the reef, and there was a loss. Of course, there was a lawsuit.
Of course, there was. Yeah.
And then I think they, with the proceeds from the lawsuit, they created some sort of trust fund. I think that's supposed to support their education for a long time. Maybe a happy ending.
Now, something you talk about here on Yap, you talked about stone money, and I had actually heard a special on NPR, I think a couple of years ago, about the stone money of Yap. It's a fascinating concept. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on it, but in Yap they do use money that's made out of rock, and it's these huge discs. They're maybe 12 feet high, and they have a hole in the middle. They're made out of limestone. They're 2,000 pounds, and they're quarried on another island south called Palau, where I'd later end up. But they carried them back by canoe, outrigger canoe. And sometimes you go to another culture and you expect to find the way they do things differently and the things that they do better, but 2,000-pound money is not better. It's worse.
It's not pocket change.
No. And it's too heavy to actually move around, so people just remember who owns what.
Can you have a part of one? Can you? I own a quarter of that stone coin there. Because
Maybe.
like you said that sometimes it's in front of somebody's house, but it used to belong to them, but now it belongs to the guy down the street, and everybody knows that. So no use moving it. We just know it belongs to Chief Chuck.
Exactly.
And I remember on an NPR piece they said some of the stone money is actually in the ocean under the sea, and people still count it as money that someone owns, and they can transfer the wealth even though it's under the ocean.
Yeah, that's right. And it doesn't even matter necessarily how large or how heavy the stones are to determine its value. It's more based on how difficult it was to get it from Palau to Yap across the ocean.
That is so bizarre. And how old are they, these stone coins?
Some of them are really quite old. They don't necessarily know exactly, but I want to say 500 to 1,000 years old.
Wow.
But they continued to quarry them up until the early 1900s, when an enterprising dentist from Hong Kong hired a steamship and started carrying the stone money from Palau directly to Yap instead of by canoe, and it actually inflated the value of the stone money, so it almost collapsed the currency.
So he had a policy of quantitative easing and inflated the currency.
Exactly.
Wow, interesting. I'm sure there's probably been some good little economics papers written on this in the high-flying academic world, anyway. But I found it interesting to run across it because I had heard the NPR piece, like I said, maybe a year or two ago, and it stuck with me as just a bizarre economic concept, but one that somehow seems to kind of work for them. And
I don't think it scales all that well.
Yeah. So anyway, you left Yap and you went to Palau, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And that's where you kind of settled.
Yeah, I began to realize that geography and the sort of physical place where you find yourself isn't necessarily that related to happiness.
Uh-huh.
I'd been on these really beautiful outer islands of Yap, but it wasn't really what I was looking for, and I started to recognize that I needed to sort of settle in and establish myself in a place and create real lasting relationships, and maybe that would be more satisfying than just the beauty of the place where I happen to be.
So is that what you learned, that people matter more than place?
Well, that was part of what I learned. I actually chose Palau because this is also embarrassing, but I made this Excel spreadsheet of comparing the different population densities of different islands, and it had about 20,000 people in it. So I thought it would be a little bit larger in that sense, but not as populated as Guam, which has, I think, 300,000 people. So, and in Palau, I think they have 300 islands, but only 7 are inhabited, and it seemed like the right place. And when I went, I decided I'm going to stay and make it work no matter what. And fortunately, I'm maybe in my 5th night there. I was coming back to the dock one evening, and a group of people were about to go kayaking on a full moon kayak ride, and and I asked if I could join them, and they said if we have an extra seat, sure. And it turns out they did, and I was seated in this kayak with a woman who I couldn't see. It was completely dark. We would later end up actually getting married, but for the first 3 hours we couldn't see each other's faces. It was like meeting somebody in a confession booth.
So
not that I meet a lot of people in confession booths, Bill.
So it couldn't have been love at first sight then.
Right, it was love at first. What here?
Here, experience, yeah.
But it was a really great place to start a relationship, not just on a kayak because it was so romantic, but on this island where we had no friends in common, no family around, so there was nobody asking for updates or wanting to know where it was heading. Was it serious? It could sort of evolve on its own pace and its own trajectory, and that was really a fortunate thing.
Did she quit a .com company and break up with her boyfriend and move to a Pacific island to find joy and happiness?
No, she's a lawyer.
Oh.
She's a lawyer and still is a lawyer from San Diego. She was working for the Supreme Court of Palau as a clerk, and her boss actually had, according to the Wall Street Journal, her boss, the Supreme Court judge of Palau, had the second best job in the world. I don't know if you remember who the first best job was. It was Bob Barker on The Price is Right, who has got to give away cars and be surrounded by beautiful women, but she worked for the number 2 guy.
And she was just clerking for them. Did they work under a U.S. system?
Yeah. Oddly, they model their legal system on the state of Oregon. And they had to pick one, and so that's one they chose, and so they need a lot of American-trained lawyers. It's a funny place, Palau. The U.S. government gave them $450 million to control their foreign policy. They gave it to them all in one lump sum.
Wow.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of money.
A lot of money. And with basically no questions asked beyond that they vote with the U.S. at the UN. And, so the coalition of the willing always includes, the U.S., Palau, and Israel.
And, so with 20,000 people, that's a lot of money per person.
Yeah, and especially when you add in the fact that the Japanese and the Taiwanese and the Chinese were also all competing for influence in Palau. And so,
why? What's there?
It's really, I think it's their vote. It's their vote in the UN, and so the Taiwanese try to get their vote versus the Chinese, and vice versa. And the Japanese are looking for influence, so they gave them $60 million for a bridge, and it goes on and on. And but I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was is that one vote that important for the U.S. But we have a long history in the Western Pacific after World War II.
Yeah.
And, I never did quite get my mind around it, though.
Well, you missed your chance. You could have taken one of those little Micronesian islands and taken over, and then you could have, offered to sell your influence.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestion. It's not in the book, but my wife and I, or my girlfriend at the time, we ended up on this little sailboat looking for. With this guy who claimed he had found an undiscovered island in the Western Pacific, and we crewed on this. It turns out he was seasick for the first 3 days, and it was just clouds from the satellite maps.
Oh no!
But we gave it a shot, I guess. So.
Well, you wouldn't be the first to have their dream of treasure be something that was a mirage. And so anyway, in the end, according to your book title, that you might just find happiness and fall in love. And so you quit your job, you broke up your relationship, you went to the Pacific, had a grand adventure, and found the love of your life. I mean, it's a pretty good story. It's a Cinderella thing,
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of hijinks in between, and a lot of missteps, But I guess I learned really 3 important things out there that I sort of took away from it. The first is to not fall for that time-sucking illusion that loyalty to bad choices will somehow make them better. Commitment to bad choices usually just makes them worse. Don't you think?
Yes. You got to learn to cut your losses in life, and
Exactly.
and investments and everything.
Exactly, and the second is I really learned to stay focused on the things that I actually care about, Yeah, it sounds so simple, but I think a lot of us spend a huge amount of energy working towards goals that aren't really meaningful or other people's goals.
Yes.
And yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you live your life for other people often. I mean, many people do. It's hard to. I always think of Oscar Wilde, who said selfishness is not living your life as you wish to, but selfishness is expecting other people to live their lives as you want them to. And so, it's fine to claim your own destiny. Nothing is selfish about that. And so I'm sure you ran into that a little bit when you decided to do this. Probably people say, are you crazy? You're giving up all that we did for you for the career that you're having, and now you're going to chunk it all and go do this. But now you're back in civilization, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that's right. And before I left there, reactions tend to fall in one of three categories. The first was, "Oh man, I want to do that too. Tell me how it goes." That sounds perfect. Mm-hmm. Another third were like they didn't really have a way to understand it, and because there's no script that people can follow. And then the third was not quite hostility, but serious doubt. Before I left, I asked everybody if they could send me with just one book to the Pacific, what would it be? Mm-hmm. And my mom's choice was pretty indicative. She gave me Into the Wild.
About
the guy who goes in the wilderness and dies.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Mom. Yeah, leave it to Mom.
Yeah, but one thing I really did take away from there, and the big takeaway for me was that if you have a dream, and I know this sounds hokey, Bill, but if you have a dream, something you really want to do, to not get too tangled up in your own underpants about it. Asking yourself if it's the right thing, and don't listen to the experts, because when it comes to the big decisions, the big choices, we're all just beginners.
Well, the other thing I'd like to point out that I really liked about your book is that you took 100 books with you, a lot of books that you felt like I've never actually read these, so I've got to read the great books, and where better to do it but on an island surrounded by beauty. And I like that you incorporated those books into a lot of your writing in a Twainian sense. It's kind of like roughing it, where you not only get a good journey, but you get a good intellectual journey also. So I like the way you merge the two.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Well, we're out of time. Excuse me. We're out of time, so I'm going to have to give your book one last push here. The book, again, is A Beginner's Guide to Paradise, 9 Steps to Giving Up Everything so you too can move to a Pacific island, wear a loincloth, read 100 books, build a bungalow, diaper a baby monkey, and maybe, just maybe, fall in love. And that is what happened to Alex Sheshunoff. Now that we're at the end of the interview, I'm going to ask you how to say your name. Sheshunoff, is that right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay. And so it's a wonderful book, and this is published by the New American Library, by Penguin Random House. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Alex. I enjoyed it. If you want to hear this again in a podcast, you can get us on Good Books Radio on our Facebook page or Good Books Radio YouTube. For Good Books Radio and for audiobooks.com, I'm your host, Dr. W.F. Strong, signing off, and here's hoping that all your books are good reads.